The sleepy town of Brookhaven, Mississippi, stretched lazily beneath a sky that glowed with the soft hues of a fading day. Rows of neatly painted homes stood like silent sentinels along streets, so quiet you could hear the cicadas humming their endless song through the thick, warm air. To an outsider, it might have seemed like a postcard of small-town serenity, a place where time slowed down and life unfolded at an unhurried pace. But beneath that tranquil surface, something darker pulsed, a tension woven into the fabric of the town, unspoken yet impossible to ignore. Jack Carter knew it well, a former Marine with a sturdy frame and eyes that cut through the haze like steel. He'd spent years mastering the art of keeping chaos at bay. After his time in the service, he'd traded the battlefield for this quiet corner of the world, seeking a simplicity he'd earned through sweat and sacrifice. His rugged face, etched with lines of experience, and a calm authority in his every step, made him stand out without trying. Trouble wasn't something he chased, but it had a stubborn habit of sniffing him out. That Sunday afternoon, Jack had taken his 8-year-old nephew Noah to a lake just beyond the town's edge. For Noah, it was a grand adventure, his small hands trembling with excitement as he reeled in a wriggling fish, his wide eyes drinking in every word of Jack's tales from his Marine days. Stories of grit, loyalty, and unshakable discipline. For Jack, it was a fleeting taste of peace, a chance to breathe in a life that didn't demand he stand at attention. The sun was slipping below the horizon now, casting streaks of gold and crimson across the sky, turning the world into a canvas of fleeting beauty. Jack guided his weathered pickup truck along the winding 2-lane road back toward Brookhaven, the engine's low rumble blending with the stillness. Beside him, Noah clutched his fishing rod and a plastic bucket, its tiny occupant sloshing faintly with every bump. "You think Grandma's gonna cook it?" Noah asked, his voice bubbling with a child's uncontainable joy. Jack's lips curved into a rare, warm smile, his gaze flicking to the boy in the rearview mirror. "Only if you clean it first, kid," he teased, his deep voice softened by affection. The road ahead lay empty, a ribbon of asphalt stretching into the dusk, and for a moment, Jack let himself relax, savoring the quiet that wrapped around them like a blanket. But that stillness shattered in an instant. Red and blue lights exploded in the rearview mirror, slicing through the twilight with a harsh, insistent pulse. Jack's hands tightened on the wheel, his knuckles whitening as years of instinct kicked in. This wasn't a casual stop, could feel it in the air, heavy and charged. Like the moment before a storm breaks, Noah's head whipped around, his excitement draining away as uncertainty crept into his small frame. "Uncle Jack," his voice quivered, a fragile thread of sound. Jack kept his eyes forward, his tone steady as stone. "It's all right, Noah. Stay quiet, keep your hands in your lap, and don't move unless I say so." He eased the truck to the side, gravel crunching under the tires as he killed the engine. His movements were slow, deliberate, every shift of his shoulders calculated to signal calm. He'd been in tighter spots than this, places where a single misstep could turn a spark into an inferno. He wasn't about to let this one ignite. Two figures emerged from the cruiser behind them, their silhouettes sharp against the flashing lights. The first, Officer Grady, was a stocky man with shoulders like a linebacker and a swagger that oozed arrogance. Each heavy step he took radiated a hunger for control, a man who thrived on bending others to his will. His partner, Officer Tucker, was taller, leaner, with a weary frame that moved with a serpent's grace. His sharp eyes darted over the scene, probing for weakness, a predator sizing up its prey. Jack rolled down the window, keeping his hands in plain sight on the steering wheel, his breathing steady despite the weight pressing against his chest. "License and registration," Grady barked, his voice cutting through the air like a blade, impatience dripping from every syllable. Jack nodded, his motions slow as he reached for his wallet, then the glove box. "I'm getting the registration," he said calmly, glancing at Noah to reassure the boy. He pulled out the documents with care, handing them over without a flicker of hesitation. Tucker circled the truck, his gaze slithering over every inch of it, lingering on Noah's small form in the passenger seat. "Got yourself a little passenger, huh?" he drawled, his tone laced with something unsettling. Jack kept his voice even, a steel thread running through it. "Just heading home from fishing," Grady sneered. flipping through Jack's ID with exaggerated scrutiny. Jack Carter. Marine, huh? Think that makes you special? His smirk widened, a challenge glinting in his eyes. Jack's jaw clenched, a faint ripple of tension beneath his calm exterior. Just makes me disciplined, he replied, each word measured, sharp, a quiet defiance that hung in the air. Tucker chuckled, leaning closer to Noah's window, his breath fogging the glass. Cute kid. Shame if he had to see something unpleasant. Jack's grip on the wheel tightened, his knuckles straining, but his voice stayed steady as granite. There's no need for that. Grady handed the ID to Tucker, who sauntered back to the cruiser, their smirks exchanging silent promises of trouble. Jack caught it all in the mirror with the way they fed off each other's energy. Two men drunk on the power they wielded like a club. What's the hurry, Carter? Grady pressed, stepping closer, his bulk looming over the truck. No hurry, Jack said, his tone flat. We're just trying to get home. Tucker returned, a smirk curling his lips. Brake lights out. Jack frowned, a flicker of doubt crossing his mind. It was working fine earlier. Grady's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. You calling me a liar? Jack met his stare, unflinching. No, sir. Just saying it was fine when I checked. Grady leaned into the window, his face inches from Jack's, his breath thick with the stench of unchecked authority. Step out of the vehicle. Jack hesitated, his gaze flicking to Noah, whose small hands gripped the bucket tighter. Stay in your seat, he murmured to the boy, his voice soft but firm, before opening the door. The gravel crunched under his boots as he stepped out, his broad frame rising to meet the officers. He stood tall, his calm unshaken, but every nerve in his body hummed with alertness. These weren't professionals doing their job, were hunters looking for a fight. Grady gestured toward Noah. Kid stays in the car for now. Jack's eyes hardened. Leave him out of this. Grady's smirk deepened, a twisted satisfaction lighting his face. We'll decide what needs to happen here. Tucker moved toward Noah's door, and Jack stepped forward instinctively, his body a shield between the officer and the boy. He stays in the truck, he said, his voice low, a command wrapped in velvet. For a split second, the officers froze, caught off guard by the steel in his tone. This wasn't a man who'd break easily. Tucker slammed Noah's door shut, the sound jolting the boy, who flinched but kept his eyes locked on Jack. All right, tough guy, Tucker sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. Let's see what you're hiding. Jack's fists clenched at his sides, his muscles coiling beneath his steady exterior. Fear wasn't in him, was weighing every move, every word, his mind a battlefield of strategy. Grady leaned in closer, his breath hot against Jack's ear. You got a problem following orders, Marine. Jack straightened, his gaze piercing through the officer's bravado. No problem. Just don't involve the kid. From the moment their eyes had met his, Jack knew this wouldn't end with a ticket. It was a collision course, a test of wills between men who abused their power and a man who'd learned justice. Wasn't just a word, it was a line you held, no matter the cost. Grady took a step forward, his boots grinding the gravel with a sound that echoed in the tense silence. His eyes burned with smug certainty. A man who'd grown fat on intimidation and never met a pushback he couldn't crush. You're a long way from home, aren't you? He said, his voice thick with condescension. Jack didn't flinch, his stance rooted like an oak. Just heading home with my nephew. Grady ignored him, flipping through the registration again, as if hoping to unearth some hidden sin. Brookhaven's a small town, he continued, his tone taunting. Not a lot of folks passing through who look like you. Where you coming from? Fishing. Jack replied, keeping it short, offering no fuel for the fire Grady was stoking. Tucker circled back around, his eyes lingering on Noah through the glass. That your boy in there? My nephew, Jack corrected, his voice a quiet blade. Grady's grin twisted. Nice family outing. Shame it's ending like this. He tossed the ID to Tucker, who disappeared into the cruiser again, leaving Grady looming over Jack like a storm cloud. You know, Grady said, crossing his arms, we get all types rolling through here. Some respect the rules, others think they're above them. Which type are you? Jack met his gaze, steady as a rock. The kind that follows the law. Grady's smirk faltered, replaced by a harder edge. A flicker of irritation that Jack wouldn't bend. Law-abiding, huh? Let's hope so. He stepped closer, invading Jack's space, daring him to react. But Jack had faced down worse than Thisman with guns. Not just egos, and he knew how to hold his ground without firing a shot. Tucker slunk back, shaking his head with mock disappointment. Clean. Grady's eyes glinted. Well, isn't that something? But here's the thing, Mariner brake lights out. You know that. Jack's brow creased, but he kept his composure. It was working earlier today. Grady's smirk stretched wide, a wolf baring its teeth. So now you're questioning me. Jack's voice stayed calm, a still lake hiding depths. Not questioning anything, just stating a fact. Grady leaned in, his breath a sour wave of arrogance. Let me tell you how this works, Carter. Out here, we ask the questions. You answer them, got it? Jack's eyes locked with his, unyielding. Understood. Tucker tapped on Noah's window, the sharp rap making the boy jump. Though he held his uncle's instructions like a lifeline, staring straight ahead. Grady noticed and grinned, a cruel spark lighting his face. Got yourself a nervous passenger there. What's the matter, kid? Something on your mind? Jack's voice cut through, sharp and low. Leave him out of this. Tucker straightened, feigning surprise. Protective, aren't we? Relax. Tough guy. Just making conversation. But there was no innocence in his words, only a taunt. A prod to see how far Jack could be pushed. Inside the truck, Noah's small chest rose and fell faster, his fingers digging into the bucket's edge, the fish forgotten as fear crept into his wide eyes. He wanted to call out to Jack, to ask if they'd be okay. But his uncle's words echoed in his mind, stay quiet. Don't move, and he clung to them like a shield. Outside, Grady's smugness swelled, feeding off the tension he'd created. He didn't care about brake lights or fishing trips. This was about power. About reminding Jack who held it. Tucker, meanwhile, watched with a quieter menace, his sharp mind turning over every detail, waiting for Jack to slip. Jack stood firm, a pillar of restraint against the storm brewing around him. He could feel the weight of their intent, the way they twisted justice into a weapon to wield against him. But he'd seen real justice fought for it. Bled for it, and he knew it didn't bend to men like these. The lesson was clear. Power, unchecked, corrupted everything it touched. And the consequences would ripple far beyond this gravel shoulder. For Jack, this wasn't just about standing up, it was about showing Noah what it meant to face down wrong. And not blink. And as the officers circled, their arrogance clashing with his quiet resolve, the air crackled with the promise of what was to come. The late afternoon sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt where Jack's old truck sat parked on the side of the dusty road. A faint breeze rustled the sparse trees lining the horizon, their skeletal branches swaying as if whispering warnings about the encounter unfolding below. Jack stood motionless, his broad shoulders squared, his hands pressed against the sun-warmed hood of his truck. The metal radiated heat into his palms, a stark contrast to the cold dread creeping up his spine. He kept his breathing steady, deliberate, every movement calculated to avoid giving the two men towering over him any excuse to escalate things further. But inside, a storm brewed, anger, frustration, and a gnawing sense of injustice he'd fought to bury long ago. Grady, the taller of the two officers, loomed over him like a vulture circling a wounded animal. His shadow stretched across the truck's hood, dark and oppressive, swallowing the faint gleam of the fading light. Step over here, he'd barked earlier, gesturing with a lazy flick of his hand as if Jack were some stray dog to be herded. Now, his voice dripped with a taunting edge as he leaned in closer. You don't strike me as the cooperative type, Carter. Got something tucked away you don't want us to see. His lips curled into a smirk, the kind that begged for a reaction, daring Jack to snap. Jack's jaw tightened, the muscles flexing beneath his weathered skin, but his voice remained even, almost a calm. Nothing to hide, he said, meeting Grady's gaze without flinching. I've done everything you've asked. The words felt heavy on his tongue, laced with the bitter taste of restraint. He'd been here before, cornered by men drunk on their own authority, itching to prove something. As a Marine, he'd faced worse than this, enemies with rifles, not flashlights. But this wasn't a battlefield in some distant desert. This was a quiet stretch of road in Brookhaven, and the stakes were different, more personal. His nephew, Noah, sat just feet away, watching through the truck's grimy window. Grady let out a low, guttural chuckle, the sound grating against the stillness. "Sure you have," he said, his tone thick with mockery. "But I'm starting to think you don't fit in around here. What do you say, Tucker?" He tilted his head toward his partner, who lingered near the passenger side of the truck, his posture slouched, but his eyes sharp. Tucker shrugged, his bony shoulders lifting beneath his ill-fitting uniform. He flicked a glance toward Noah, then back to Jack, his lips twitching into a faint sneer. "Looks out of place to me," he muttered, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of someone who'd grown too comfortable in his small-town power. His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Jack didn't need to ask for clarification, had heard it all before. The sideways glances, the barbed comments about his past, his truck, his life. To them, he was an outsider, a Marine who'd dared to settle in their territory. And that alone was enough to mark him as a threat. Jack's teeth ground together, his patience fraying like an old rope stretched to thin. The heat in his chest flared, a familiar ember of defiance he'd learned to smother over the years. He wanted to shove back, to wipe that smug look off Grady's face, but he knew better. Men like Grady thrived on resistancy was the spark they needed to justify whatever came next. Instead, he kept his hands steady on the hood, his posture rigid, and let the silence speak for him. Grady tapped the side of the truck with his flashlight, the dull thunk echoing in the quiet air. "So, Carter," he drawled, dragging out the name like it tasted sour. "What brings a guy like you to our little neck of the woods? Looking for trouble?" His eyes glinted with something dark, a predator sizing up its prey. "Just heading home," Jack replied, his voice a low, steady rumble. He didn't waver, didn't blink, even as Grady stepped closer, shrinking the space between them. The officer's breath carried the faint tang of tobacco and coffee, an unwelcome intrusion into Jack's senses. Grady's smirk widened, his tone sharpening. "You know, Marines like you think you're tough. All that training, all those medals. But out here," he gestured vaguely at the empty road, the barren fields beyond. "You're just another guy with a chip on his shoulder, aren't you?" The words stung, not because they were true, but because they were meant to provoke. Jack felt the heat surge again, a tidal wave of pride and anger threatening to break through his calm exterior. He could almost hear the drill sergeant's voice from years ago. "Stand your ground, Marine." But this wasn't about proving his toughness. It was about getting Noah home safe. He swallowed the retort burning in his throat and kept his eyes locked on Grady's. "I've got nothing to prove," he said, the words clipped but controlled. A small, trembling voice broke the tension. "Uncle Jack," Noah's words quivered, barely audible through the cracked window. Jack's head turned just enough to catch the boy's wide, frightened eyes peering out from the truck's cab. Noah's small hands clutched a fishing rod, its tip resting against the dashboard, a relic from their earlier trip, now a lifeline in his grip. The sight twisted something deep in Jack's chest, a fierce protectiveness surging to the surface. "Stay in the truck, Noah," Jack said firmly, his voice cutting through the haze of the moment. It wasn't a request, it was an order, born from years of instinct and discipline. He couldn't let Noah see him falter, not now. Grady snorted, a harsh, derisive sound. "Good advice, kid," he said, his eyes never leaving Jack. "You don't want to see what happens when people don't listen." He began to circle Jack, his boots crunching against the gravel, each step deliberate, predatory. "You've got that look, Carter," he continued, his voice dropping lower. "Bet I'm better than you attitude. Makes me think you're hiding something." Jack didn't rise to the bait. "You've run my ID," he said coolly. "You know I'm clean." It was a fact, not a plea, and he let it hang there, daring Grady to contradict it. For a split second, Grady's smirk faltered, a flicker of irritation breaking through his mask of control. "Smart mouth on you." "Huh," he snapped, his composure slipping. "Maybe you need a reminder about respect." Tucker, who'd been watching the exchange with a mix of amusement and unease, stepped closer, his boots scuffing the dirt. "Relax, Grady," he said, his tone lighter but laced with tension. "He's not going anywhere." His eyes darted between the two men, his confidence wavering as the air grew thicker. He wasn't as bold as Grady, not as eager to push the boundaries, But he wasn't about to back down either. He was the quieter threat, the one who'd follow orders without questioning them. Grady ignored him, his focus locked on Jack. "Respect's earned, Tucker," he said, his voice hard. "And this guy hasn't earned a damn thing." His hand twitched near his holster, a subtle but deliberate move that sent a jolt through Jack's nerves. Jack straightened, his hands lifting slightly from the hood as he met Grady's stare head-on. "I've earned plenty," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Respect isn't something you get from intimidation." The words were a quiet challenge, a line drawn in the sand. He'd faced down worse than Grady men with real power, real weapons, but this felt different. This was personal, a test of not just his strength, but his restraint. Grady's face reddened, his mask cracking further. For a moment, it seemed he might lunge, his body tensing as if coiled to strike. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he spat, his voice rising. "Think that Marine training makes you untouchable?" Jack's gaze hardened, unyielding. "It taught me to stand my ground," he said simply. The air between them grew heavy, thick with unspoken threats. Tucker shifted on his feet, his earlier swagger fading as Jack's resolve held firm. The radio on his belt crackled faintly, a burst of static that went ignored. But it was enough to punctuate the mounting tension. Grady leaned in closer, his sneer widening. "So, Carter," he began, his voice dripping with venom, "what's it like? Going from a big-shot Marine to just another nobody scraping by. Bet it stings, huh? Trading all those stripes for fishing trips and this beat-up truck." He tapped the hood again, harder this time, the sound ringing out like a gunshot in the stillness. Jack's expression remained unreadable, a fortress of calm against Grady's storm. "I served my time," he said evenly, "did my duty. That's more than most can say." His voice carried the weight of years' missions completed, lives saved, sacrifices made. Grady could mock him all he wanted. It didn't change what Jack knew about himself. Grady's laugh was dark, bitter. "Oh, I bet you did. All that discipline, all that training. And now you're just another guy who thinks he's better than everyone else." He stepped back, folding his arms as if daring Jack to contradict him. Tucker, sensing an opening, chimed in from his spot near the passenger door. "You know, people like you always think they belong everywhere," he said, his voice low and pointed. "But places like Brookhaven, we've got our own way of doing things. Outsiders tend to forget that." He tapped on Noah's window with a knuckle, the sharp tap-tap making the boy flinch inside the cab. Jack's gaze snapped to Tucker, his calm fracturing for the first time. "I'm not forgetting anything," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "I'm just trying to get my nephew home." "Outsiders," Tucker repeated, the word laced with venom. He tapped the window again, harder. His eyes locked on Noah. "You hear that, kid? Your uncle's not from around here. Probably doesn't even know how things work." "Noah," Jack said sharply, cutting through Tucker's taunts. "Look at me, don't answer him. Just stay put." His voice was a lifeline, steady and sure, pulling Noah back from the edge of fear. Grady clapped his hands, the sound harsh and mocking. "Listen to that, the big Marine giving orders." His smirk twisted into something colder, more dangerous. "Guess old habits die hard, huh, Carter? Thing is, out here, we don't take orders from you." Jack didn't flinch. "I'm not giving orders," he said, his voice low and resolute. "I'm protecting my family." The words landed like stones, solid and unmovable, a testament to the line he wouldn't let them cross. The tension thickened, a palpable force pressing down on all of them. Tucker straightened, turning to Grady with a faint grin. "You notice how he's all calm now, like he thinks if he plays nice, we'll just let him off." Grady's eyes gleamed with malice. "Oh, I don't think so. Guys like him, they act tough until someone calls their bluff." He nodded toward Tucker, a silent signal. Tucker's hand darted to the passenger door handle, his movements quick and reckless. Jack's heart slammed against his ribs, but his exterior remained a wall of steel. "Don't," he warned, his tone sharper now, a blade cutting through the haze. Tucker ignored him, yanking the door open with a screech of rusted hinges. "Step out, kid," he said, his voice a parody of authority, dripping with false bravado. Noah froze, his small frame rigid against the seat, his hands white-knuckled around the fishing rod. His wide eyes darted to Jack, pleading for rescue. Jack stepped forward, his voice a low growl. "He's just a child. Leave him alone." The words were a shield, a barrier he threw up between Noah and the chaos threatening to engulf them. "Stay where you are," Grady barked, his hand hovering near his holster, fingers twitching with intent. Jack stopped, his boots grinding into the gravel. But he didn't retreat. His voice dropped lower, quieter, every syllable a warning. "He's done nothing wrong. Whatever you think I've done, it's on men at him." Tucker laughed, a hollow, grating sound. "It's not about what he's done," he said, shaking his head as if Jack's plea were a joke. "It's about teaching you a lesson." He reached for Noah's arm, his fingers brushing the boy's sleeve. "Noah," Jack snapped, his voice a whip crack. "Stay in your seat." The boy obeyed instantly, shrinking back against the upholstery, his body trembling, but his grip on the rod unyielding. Tucker hesitated, his hand hovering midair, frustration flashing across his narrow face. Grady stepped closer, his voice a dangerous whisper. "You don't get to make the rules here, Carter. You think that Marine training makes you untouchable out here? You're just another guy we can take down a peg." Jack's jaw tightened, a steel trap clamping shut, but his voice remained steady. "That's where you're wrong. My training taught me to stand my ground even when people like you try to push me down." His words were a quiet thunder, resonating with the strength of a man who'd faced death and walked away unbroken. Grady's smirk faltered, his confidence cracking like thin ice. He recovered quickly, but the shift was there, a chink in his armor. Tucker, visibly agitated, slammed the passenger door shut with a force that rattled the truck's frame. The loud thud echoed through the evening air, startling Noah, who flinched but held back his tears, his small chest heaving with silent panic. "You see this, Grady?" Tucker said, gesturing toward Jack with a shaky hand. "He's got that look like he thinks he's still in charge." Grady nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Yeah, I see it. That's the problem. Guys like him always think they can walk through life without consequences." His tone was a blade, sharp and cold, slicing through the pretense of civility. Jack took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as he wrestled his emotions into submission. "I've complied with everything you've asked," he said, his voice a steady anchor. "If you've got a problem, take it up with me, leave the boy out of it." Grady's smirk twisted into something crueler, more sinister. "And if we don't?" he challenged, his hand brushing the butt of his holster again. Jack's eyes narrowed, a storm brewing behind their calm surface. "Then you'll show exactly who you are," he said, his words a mirror held up to Grady's soul. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the unspoken standoff stretching taut between them. Tucker glanced at Grady, his bravado slipping. "You know what?" he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I think we need to check the truck. Maybe he's hiding something." He took a step toward the passenger door again, his hand outstretched. "No," Jack said firmly, stepping in front of the door, his body a shield between Tucker and Noah. "You've got no reason to search it." Grady's hand settled fully on his holster now, his expression darkening into something feral. "You're real close to making this a lot worse for yourself, Carter," he growled, his patience unraveling. Jack met his gaze, unflinching, his voice a quiet blade. "And you're crossing a line." The two officers exchanged a look, their smugness faltering as they realized Jack wouldn't bend. For all their posturing, they were starting to see Ide wasn't the prey they'd assumed. The air crackled with tension, a storm on the verge of breaking. Jack had a choice: back down and let them claim their petty victory, or stand firm and protect Noah, no matter the cost. His stance shifted, subtle but deliberate, his body angling to shield the truck where Noah sat. His small frame pressed against the seat, trembling but trusting. Jack's voice cut through the silence, low and unyielding. "Step away from the truck," he commanded, his tone controlled but ironclad. "The boy stays out of this." Grady smirked, folding his arms as he sized Jack up. "Oh, we decide who stays out of what?" He sneered, his hand brushing his holster again. "And right now, it looks like you're trying to resist." "I'm not resisting," Jack replied, his gaze locked on Grady's, steady as stone. "I'm protecting my nephew from your harassment. That's not a crime." Inside the truck, Noah's breath hitched, his small hands tightening around the fishing rod until his knuckles turned white. He didn't understand the full weight of the moment, but he felt the danger, the defiance, the unspoken battle raging around him. His uncle stood like a wall, unwavering, and in that moment, Noah saw more than just a man. He saw a protector, a Marine who'd traded combat boots for fishing trips, but never lost the fire that defined him. Grady and Tucker didn't see it yet, but they would. Men like them always pushed too far, blind to the consequences of their own arrogance. Jack knew this, felt it in his bones, the lesson he'd learned long ago and saw playing out now. Justice wasn't just a word, it was a force, patient and relentless, waiting to topple those who abused their power. And as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in hues of blood and gold, Jack stood his ground, ready to face whatever came next, knowing the real victory wasn't in fighting back, but in refusing to break. Sweat beaded on Noah's forehead as his small, trembling hands clutched Jack's phone. His fingers fumbled over the smooth surface, slipping slightly as he swiped to unlock the screen. The boy's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a thunderous echo of the urgency his uncle had drilled into him. Only use this in an emergency, Noah. It could save us. The memory of Jack's steady voice looped in his mind, a lifeline amid the chaos swirling around him. Fear gnawed at his insides, sharp and unrelenting, but he forced himself to focus. With a shaky breath, he tapped the record button. The phone's camera whirred to life, its lens peering through the sliver of the cracked open window of the truck, silently documenting the storm brewing outside. Noah's wide eyes flicked between the glowing screen and the shadowy figures beyond the glass, his fear warring with a stubborn spark of determination he didn't even know he had. Outside, the air was thick with tension, heavy as the humid dusk pressing down on the dusty roadside. Tucker, a weary man with a face weathered by too many hard years, caught the faint glimmer of light from the truck first. His sharp, hawk-like eyes narrowed as they zeroed in on the phone's glow, and his lips twisted into a scowl of pure irritation. "What's that damn kid up to now?" he snapped, his voice rough and gravelly, slicing through the stillness like a jagged blade. He took a quick, aggressive step toward the truck, his boots crunching against the gravel with purpose. But before he could close the distance, Jack reacted a wall of muscle and resolve cutting off Tucker's path. Jack's hand shot out, firm and unyielding, pressing against the officer's chest with a quiet strength that stopped him cold. "He's staying right where he is," Jack said, his tone low but ironclad, leaving no room for argument. His broad shoulders squared, his stance a silent declaration that he'd protect Noah at any cost. Tucker's frustration erupted like a geyser, his face flushing red as he shoved forward, closing the gap until he was nearly nose to nose with Jack. "You think you're running this show," he spat, his breath hot and sour, his words dripping with contempt. Jack didn't flinch, his jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady as granite. "I think someone's got to take charge," he shot back, his gaze locked on Tucker's, unflinching and fierce. "And it's damn sure not you." From a few paces away, Greggy, a stocky figure with a barrel chest and a smirk that oozed malice, let out a low, guttural chuckle. The sound was less amusement and more a predator sizing up its prey. "You've got guts, Marine," he sneered, his voice thick with mockery. "I'll give you that. But guts don't mean squat when you're cuffed and bleeding." Jack's fists clenched at his sides, the knuckles whitening as a surge of anger pulsed through him. But he swallowed it down, forcing himself to stay composed, his mind racing to keep the situation from spiraling further. "If you're itching to arrest me, go right ahead," he said, his voice calm but edged with defiance. He tilted his head toward the truck, where Noah sat frozen, the phone still trembling in his grip. "But you leave him out of this." Tucker lunged toward the truck door again, his weary frame coiled with impatience, but Jack was faster. In an instant, he stepped squarely in front of him, his movements smooth and deliberate, a soldier's precision guiding every shift of his weight. "I said, he stays in the truck," Jack repeated, his voice a quiet thunder that seemed to shake the air. Tucker hesitated, his bravado flickering like a candle in a storm. The weary officer's eyes darted to Grady, searching for backup. But Grady wasn't about to let this go. He swaggered forward, his chest puffed out like a rooster ready to crow. his voice dripping with the kind of authority that came from a badge and a gun, rather than any real merit. "You don't get to call the shots here, Carter," he growled, his words heavy with menace. "Out here, you do what we say, or things get real messy, real fast." Jack tilted his head slightly, his calm unshaken, his hazel eyes boring into Grady's with an intensity that made the officer's bluster feel hollow. "Is that what this is?" Jack asked, his tone measured but cutting. "Proving you can shove people around, that's not authority, Grady. That's fear masquerading as power." Grady's face darkened, his cheeks flushing a deep crimson, as Jack's words sliced through his ego like a blade. His bravado cracked, just for a moment, revealing the insecurity festering beneath. "Watch your mouth, Carter," he snarled, stepping closer. "You're walking a razor's edge." Jack leaned in, just enough to make Grady feel the weight of his presence, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The edge you're crossing isn't thin, it's a glaring line in the sand, and you're about to stumble right over it." The air between them crackled, charged with a raw, electric intensity. Tucker's hand hovered near his belt, his fingers twitching with indecision, while Grady's grip tightened on his holster, his knuckles paling under the strain. Yet Jack stood firm, an unshakable barrier between the officers and the boy trembling in the truck. "You've got a big mouth," Tucker muttered, his voice thick with frustration, his weary frame shifting uneasily. "But out here, words don't mean a damn thing." Jack's eyes flicked to him, steady and piercing. "Maybe not to you," he countered, "but the truth has a way of clawing its way out, whether you bury it or not." Inside the truck, Noah's hands steadied slightly as he adjusted the phone, the lens capturing every word, every tense gesture. The boy's breath hitched, his chest tight with a mix of terror and resolve. He could feel the weight of what he was doing, recording evidence, preserving a moment that could shift everything. His uncle's strength fueled him, a quiet courage blooming amidst the fear. Grady's patience shattered like glass under a hammer. "You're done," he barked, his hand snapping to his radio with a jerky motion. "Backup's on the way. Let's see how tough you are when you're outnumbered." "Tough guy." Jack's lips pressed into a thin, resolute line. He knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about showing Noah what it meant to stand tall against tyranny, to face down those who wielded power like a club. "You don't need backup," Jack said, his voice cutting through the rising chaos like a blade. "You need to stop this right here, right now." Grady scoffed, shaking his head with a sneer, his pride too swollen to back down. "You think you've got the upper hand," he taunted. Jack took a slow, deliberate step forward, his presence a quiet force that made both officers pause. "I think you've already lost it," he said softly, but the weight of his words landed like a punch, making Tucker falter and Grady's smirk waver. Tucker's eyes darted to Noah again, then back to Jack, uncertainty creeping into his weary frame. "He's recording," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, the realization hitting him like a cold splash of water. "This could go south for us, Grady." Grady's face twisted with rage, his eyes blazing as he whirled toward the truck. "Then we make sure it never sees daylight," he snarled, taking a step toward Noah. Jack's reaction was immediate. He slid into Grady's path, his body a shield, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "You touch that phone, and you'll only dig your hole deeper," he warned. "You think this ends with me. It doesn't." For a fleeting moment, Grady hesitated, his bluster faltering under the weight of Jack's unyielding resolve. But his pride roared back, refusing to let him retreat. "You've got no clue who you're messing with," he hissed. Jack's response was steel, "And neither do you." The officers exchanged a glance, their confidence crumbling like dry earth underfoot. Grady opened his mouth, but no words came. The faint crackle of his radio broke the silence, static hissing through the tense air. Tucker took a small, reluctant step back, his hand falling away from his belt, his weary frame slumping slightly as doubt took root. Jack didn't budge, his voice steady as ever, carrying the weight of a man who'd stared down worse threats than this. "This ends here," he said. "Walk away now, or live with the consequences of what you choose next. It's your call." Grady's jaw clenched, his pride locked in a brutal tug of war with the reality staring him down. Tucker's eyes flicked to Noah again, then to Grady, his voice uncertain. "Grady." Maybe we should. Grady cut him off with a glare sharp enough to draw blood. Not another word. The standoff teetered on a knife's edge, but Jack knew he'd shifted the tide. His calm, his refusal to bend, his quiet authority, it had all tilted the balance in his favor. Then Grady's hand moved, slow and deliberate, to his holster. His fingers curled around the grip of his gun, the smirk fading from his face, replaced by a hardened, dangerous glare. "You want to keep playing games, Carter," he growled, yanking the weapon free and leveling it at Jack's chest. "I said cooperate, or this gets ugly fast." Jack didn't flinch. His posture remained steady, his eyes locked on Grady's, reading every twitch, every flicker of doubt. "You don't want to do that," he said evenly, his voice calm, but laced with a steely edge that cut deeper than any shout. Grady's lips curled into a sneer, his grip tightening on the gun. "You think I won't?" he snapped. "You think I'm bluffing?" Jack's gaze didn't waver. "I think you're reckless," he replied. "And you're making the kind of mistake you don't walk away from." Tucker shifted uncomfortably, his weary frame rigid with tension. His hand hovered near his own belt, but he didn't draw, his voice cracking with unease. "Grady, maybe we should shut up." "Tucker," Grady barked, his focus unwavering, though his control was slipping through his fingers like sand. Everyone could feel if power he clung to was unraveling, and Jack's steady presence only hastened its collapse. Inside the truck, Noah's hands shook as he angled the phone, zooming in on the scene. His face was pale, his breath shallow, but his resolve held firm. He captured at Al Grady's gun, Tucker's conflicted frown, Jack's unshakable defiance. "You don't aim a weapon at a child's guardian," Jack said, his voice dropping lower, more deliberate, each word a hammer striking stone. "That's not protecting and serving. That's cowardice wearing a badge." Grady's jaw clenched, his knuckles whitening around the gun's grip. "I told you to cooperate," he barked, his voice fraying at the edges. Jack took a slow step to the side, his movements calculated, forcing Grady to adjust his aim. The shift threw the officer off balance, his stance faltering as he stumbled slightly to reposition himself. Jack seized the moment, pivoting smoothly and using the truck's edge to shield himself partially. "Stay still," Grady shouted, his voice cracking with frustration as he struggled to regain control. But Jack's training shone through, didn't lunge or strike back. Instead, he kept moving just enough to stay unpredictable, his every step a chess move designed to buy time. "Put the gun down," he said, his voice sharp and commanding. "Before you do something you can't undo." Tucker's resolve cracked further, his voice trembling as he stepped forward. "Grady, this is going too far," he pleaded, his weary frame tense with fear. Grady ignored him, his frustration boiling over. "You think you're smarter than me?" He spat at Jack, his gun trembling slightly in his grip. Jack didn't answer. His silence was a weapon, fueling Grady's rage and exposing his weakness. Noah adjusted the phone again, his small hands steadying as he captured every detail. Grady's wavering aim, Tucker's growing doubt, Jack's calm resolve. "What's the kid doing now?" Tucker asked, his voice tight with unease as he glanced toward the truck. "He's filming," he said, the words landing like a thunderclap. Grady's face contorted with fury, his eyes blazing as he took a step toward Noah. "Turn that damn thing off," he bellowed, his voice a raw, desperate roar. Jack intercepted him instantly, planting himself firmly between Grady and the truck. "He's not turning anything off," he said, his tone unyielding, a fortress of strength. Grady's gun wavered, the barrel dipping as his rage began to fracture into doubt. Tucker saw it too. "Grady," he said again, more forcefully, "we're crossing a line here. This isn't right." Grady whipped his head toward Tucker, his face a mask of red-hot fury. "You siding with him now?" he snarled, but the question hung unanswered in the air. The truth was undeniable. Justice wasn't on their side, and the consequences of their abuse of power were closing in, captured forever on a trembling boy's phone. Jack stood tall, a beacon of resolve, teaching Noah and the officers a lesson they'd never forget. Real strength lies in standing firm, and those who wield power unjustly will always face the reckoning of their choices. In the thickening dusk along Highway 16 near Brookhaven, the air crackled with tension so palpable it seemed to hum against the skin. Jack stood resolute in front of his weathered truck, his broad shoulders squared, hands lifted slightly as if to hold back the storm brewing before him. His voice sliced through the chaos with a calm that felt almost unnatural, a piercing clarity born from conviction. "Shut your mouth, Tucker," he said, his words steady but edged with steel, locking eyes with the younger officer whose usual swagger had begun to falter. "You don't get to tell me how to handle this." Inside Jack's chest, a quiet fury simmered, not loud or reckless, but deep, rooted in a man who'd seen enough of the world to know when lines were crossed. He could feel the fracture in their unity, a jagged split he intended to widen. Grady, the older of the two officers, gripped his pistol with hands that betrayed him, trembling ever so slightly under the weight of a moment spiraling beyond his control. His voice, once a bark of authority, cracked as he snapped, "You've got nowhere to go." But the bravado rang hollow, a thin veneer over the doubt creeping into his gut. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool evening air, his breaths coming heavier, sharper, as if each inhale dragged him deeper into a pit he'd dug himself. He'd always prided himself on commanding, bending situations to his will, but now, with Jack's unflinching gaze boring into him, that pride felt like a fraying rope slipping through his fingers. Jack took a deliberate step forward, his boots crunching against the gravel shoulder of the road, the sound sharp against the distant hum of traffic. His hands stayed raised, not in surrender but in a quiet plea for reason. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his tone low and measured, "and neither is he." He tilted his head toward the truck, where Noah, his young nephew, sat clutching a phone that glowed faintly in the dim cab. Jack's heart tightened at the sight, Noah's small frame rigid with fear, yet steady with purpose. "But you've got a choice, Grady. End this now, or let it twist into something you can't come back from." The words hung heavy, a lifeline tossed to a drowning man. Though Jack knew Grady's pride might choke him before he grabbed it, Tucker shifted beside his partner, his lean frame tense, his usual cocky smirk replaced by a flicker of unease that danced across his sharp features. He stepped closer to Grady, his voice dropping to a tone that carried less bite, more caution. "He's right, man. This isn't worth it." Inside, Tucker's mind raced images of reprimands, of headlines, of a career unraveling like thread pulled from a seam. He'd followed Grady's lead for years, trusting the older man's bluster to carry them through. But now that trust wavered, a fragile thing buckling under the weight of Jack's quiet defiance and the boy's watchful eyes. The tension coiled tighter, a spring wound to its breaking point, every tick of the clock stretching into an eternity. Grady's eyes flicked wildly, first to Jack, standing like a pillar of stone, then to Tucker, whose resolve seemed to crumble with each passing second, and finally to Noah, whose phone still captured every faltering breath, every tremor of doubt. "Damn it," Grady muttered, the curse slipping out under his breath as he lowered the gun just a fraction, the barrel dipping toward the ground. His fingers twitched, reluctant to let go entirely. As if holstering it meant surrendering more than just this moment, it meant admitting he'd lost the reins. Jack didn't budge, his body a shield between the officers and the truck, his voice softening but never wavering. "Good. Now put it away." There was no triumph in his tone, only a quiet insistence. A man who understood that justice wasn't about gloating, it was about standing firm, until the cracks in power showed themselves. Grady's face twisted with frustration, a storm of rage and shame brewing behind his eyes. With a rough, almost violent motion, he shoved the gun back into its holster, the leather creaking under the force. Tucker exhaled, a shaky breath that mingled relief with the lingering dread still thick in the air. "This doesn't have to go any further," he said, locking eyes with Jack, searching for an out. Jack nodded, his voice as steady as ever. "That's up to you." But Grady's face told a different story, anger etched deep into the lines of his brow, humiliation burning in his flushed cheeks. He'd built his world on control, on the badge that gave him sway over others. And now that world teetered, exposed by a man who refused to bend and a child who dared to document it. Tucker, meanwhile, seemed to shrink under the weight of it all, his bravado stripped away, leaving a man who'd glimpsed the edge of ruin and didn't like what he saw. Inside the truck, Noah's hands had finally steadied, though his heart still pounded against his narrow chest. The phone trembled slightly as he switched from recording to dialing, his small fingers moving with a precision that belied his age. He pressed it to his ear, his voice quivering but clear as he whispered into the line. "I'm at Highway 16 near Brookhaven. Two police officers are threatening my uncle. Please send help." His brown eyes darted to the open window, catching the glint of Grady's holstered gun, the slump of Tucker's shoulders. Fear had gripped him earlier, a cold fist around his lungs, but now it gave way to something fiercer, a resolve forged in the quiet lessons Jack had taught him about right and wrong, about standing tall even when your knees shook. Tucker's head snapped toward the truck, his face paling as he caught sight of Noah's small silhouette against the cab's faint light. "Grady," he hissed, urgency sharpening his tone. "The kid just called 911. Grady froze, his broad frame going rigid for a heartbeat, his expression hardening into something feral. He wheeled back to Jack, his voice rising with a fury that barely masked his panic. "What the hell are you teaching him?" The words exploded from him, raw and jagged, a man grasping at the last threads of his authority. Jack didn't flinch, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade honed by years of patience. "I'm teaching him to stand up for what's right, something you clearly missed along the way." His eyes narrowed, not with malice, but with a clarity that pinned Grady where he stood. Inside, Jack felt a swell of pride for Noah, mingled with a bitter ache for the world that forced a boy so young to bear such weight. This wasn't just about them anymore, it was about the lesson echoing beyond this stretch of asphalt. Power unchecked breeds its own downfall. Tucker shifted uneasily, his confidence eroding like sand under a tide. He glanced between Grady's simmering rage and Jack's unyielding calm, his usual smirk replaced by a frown that creased his brow. "Grady, this is bad," he muttered, his voice low, almost pleading. "We should stop before." "Before what?" Grady snapped, rounding on his partner with a snarl. "You want to back down? Let him win." Tucker hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line, his silence louder than any answer. He'd always been the follower, the one who rode Grady's coattails. But now that loyalty felt like a noose tightening around his neck. Jack seized the moment, his voice sharp and precise, a surgeon's scalpel cutting through the mess. "You're unraveling, Grady. You know it, and so does he." He nodded toward Tucker, whose shoulders slumped further, a man caught between loyalty and the dawning realization of consequences. "Every second you stand here, digging yourself deeper, the worse it gets." Grady clenched his fists, his knuckles whitening, the frustration radiating off him in waves. "You don't know what you're talking about." He spat, but the words lacked bite, a desperate grasp at a crumbling facade. "No," Jack challenged, his tone unwavering. "The kid's recording. He called 911. Every move you've made, every threat you've barked, it's all on tape. You think this ends here? It doesn't." The truth landed like a stone, heavy and unmovable. And Tucker's confidence crumbled further, his hand running nervously through his hair. "He's right, Grady," he admitted, reluctance threading through his voice. "This is already out of control." Grady's glare hardened, his pride a stubborn ember refusing to die. "Not until I say it is," he growled, yanking his radio from his belt with a jerk. The static crackled to life, a harsh burst of sound against the stillness, and his voice spilled out, clipped and frantic. "Officer needs assistance on Highway 16. Situation escalating. Request immediate support." His fingers gripped the device tighter, as if it could anchor him to the authority slipping through his grasp. Jack tilted his head, a faint smirk tugging at his lips, and cruel, but knowing. "Backup won't save you," he said, his voice low and cutting. "It'll just bring more witnesses." Grady shot him a venomous glare, but the bravado was thinning, the cracks in his confidence widening under the pressure. Tucker took a cautious step back, his hand hovering away from his belt, his tone almost pleading now. "Grady, we need to stop this before it gets worse." "Shut up, Tucker," Grady roared, his anger lashing out at everyone around him, a cornered animal snapping at its cage. Jack remained a pillar of calm, his gaze steady as he said, "He's trying to save you from yourself. You should listen." But Grady ignored him, pacing in short, agitated bursts, his boots scuffing the gravel as he clutched the radio like a lifeline. The silence that followed was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of tires on distant asphalt. a reminder of a world beyond this standoff. Inside the truck, Noah adjusted the phone with trembling but determined hands, angling it to frame both officers clearly against the fading light. His small face was set, his earlier terror replaced by a quiet strength that seemed to radiate from his core. He'd watched Jack all his life, watched him fix engines, mend fences, and stand firm when others faltered. And now, in this moment, he channeled that same resolve. A boy becoming more than he'd ever expected under the weight of necessity. Grady finally stopped pacing, turning back to Jack with a forced smirk that didn't reach his eyes. You think you've got the upper hand now? Think again. Backup's coming, and when they get here, you'll be the one in cuffs. His voice strained to reclaim its old fire, but it trembled at the edges, a hollow echo of the man he'd been an hour ago. Jack's expression didn't shift, his calm a stark contrast to Grady's fraying edges. Maybe, he said evenly, but when they see the footage, who do you think they'll believe? Grady's smirk faltered, his bravado splintering further under Jack's relentless clarity. Tucker, standing a few feet away, dragged a hand through his hair again, his nerves raw and exposed. You're playing a dangerous game, Grady muttered, his voice quieter now, almost to himself. I'm not playing, Jack replied, his words a quiet thunder. But you are, and you're losing. The tension shattered as the distant wail of sirens pierced the air, their high-pitched tones slicing through the stillness like a blade. Grady's face stiffened, a flicker of panic mingling with the anger in his eyes. Tucker exhaled shakily, the sound almost a release. They're here, he murmured, glancing toward the horizon where red and blue lights pulsed faintly against the dusk. Grady's grip on his radio tightened, but his resolve wavered, his gaze darting from Jack to Noah and finally to Tucker. For a fleeting moment, he seemed to weigh his choices, the burden of his actions pressing down like a physical force. Jack's voice broke through again, firm but not unkind. It's over, Grady. You know it. Tucker knows it. Don't make this worse for yourself. Grady didn't respond, his jaw clenching as he fought to hold onto a situation that had slipped far beyond his reach. The sirens grew louder, their wail filling the air as a sleek cruiser rolled to a stop a few yards away, its tires crunching against the gravel. Two officers stepped out, their movements crisp and deliberate, uniforms sharp against the fading light. Officer Miller, a young black man with eyes that missed nothing, surveyed the scene with a commanding presence that belied his years. Beside him, Officer Ramirez, lean and focused, adjusted his belt with a practiced motion, his gaze sweeping the standoff with quiet intensity. What's going on here? Miller asked, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the lingering echoes of Grady's defiance. His sharp eyes flicked from Grady's holstered weapon to Tucker's nervous stance, then to Jack's steady posture. Grady straightened, scrambling to reclaim some shred of authority. We've got this under control, he snapped, but the words sounded brittle, a cracked shield against Miller's scrutiny. Doesn't look like it, Miller said evenly, his tone leaving no room for bluster. You called for backup, so start explaining. Jack stepped forward, drawing Miller's attention, his voice steady as stone. Officer, I need you to see something. Grady's head whipped around, his face tightening with fresh panic. He's lying, he blurted, desperation clawing at his voice. He's resisting arrest. Miller held up a hand, silencing Grady with a single gesture. I'll get to that, he said, his gaze shifting back to Jack. What do you have? The question hung in the air, a pivot point in a night that had already stretched afar, a moment where justice might finally tip the scales against the wreckage of misused power. The evening air was thick with tension, a palpable weight pressing down on everyone as Jack stood near the rusted old truck, his hand trembling slightly as he gestured toward it. His voice, though steady, carried an undercurrent of urgency as he called out to Noah, the young boy who lingered near the vehicle's open door. Ring the phone, Jack said, his words cutting through the stillness like a sharp wind. Noah froze for a heartbeat, his wide eyes darting toward the two figures looming near Grady and Tucker before he steeled. Himself, his small frame moved with a quiet determination as he stepped out, the phone gripped so tightly in his hands that his knuckles turned white against his pale skin. The boy's face was a mask of fear and resolve, his breath shallow as he crossed the uneven ground toward Jack. every step a testament to the courage bubbling beneath his fragile exterior. Jack took the phone from Noah's trembling fingers, his own heart pounding as he handed it over to Miller, the stern officer whose presence seemed to anchor the chaotic scene. Noah had been recording every angry word, every threat, every moment of this unraveling nightmare, and now the evidence rested in Miller's hands. Grady, a burly man with a temper as volatile as a storm, lurched forward, his voice rising in a jagged crescendo. "You don't seriously believe," he began, but Miller cut him off with a single, sharp command. "Stop." Miller snapped, his tone slicing through Grady's protest like a blade through cloth. Authority radiated from him, cold and unyielding, as he turned to Ramirez, a weary officer who had been watching the exchange in silence, his dark eyes flickering with quiet intensity. "Watch them," Miller ordered, and Ramirez gave a curt nod. Stepping forward to position himself between Grady, Tucker, and Jack, his posture a silent warning. Miller unlocked the phone, his face an unreadable mask as he began scrolling through the footage. The air grew heavier with each passing second, the faint crackle of the video's audio spilling into the silence like a confession no one wanted to hear. Grady's voice, brash and menacing, echoed from the tiny speaker. "You think you can outsmart us?" Miller's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as he repeated the words aloud, his voice low and icy. "Is that what you said to him?" Grady's mouth opened, a retort forming on his lips, but the words died in his throat, choked by the weight of Miller's gaze. Beside him, Tucker shifted uncomfortably, his broad shoulders hunching as he stared at the dirt beneath his boots, unwilling or unable to meet anyone's eyes. As Miller continued watching, his expression darkened, shadows pooling in the lines of his weathered face. The video captured it all: Grady's barked orders, the glint of his weapon as he pointed it at Jack, and a child's frightened gasp in the background. "Leave him alone, as just a child," Miller said, his voice rising with barely contained fury as he locked eyes with Grady. "You pointed your weapon at him." Grady's face flushed a deep, angry red, his hands twitching at his sides as he stammered. He wasn't cooperative, he had to, but Miller's voice sliced through the excuse like a guillotine. "No, you didn't have to do any of this." Ramirez edged closer, his hand resting casually on his belt, though his posture was anything but relaxed. "We've got enough here to bring them both in," he murmured to Miller, his voice steady and resolute. Miller nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on Grady. "Not yet," he said, his tone sharp as a whip. "Explain yourself, now." Grady's hands curled into fists, his knuckles whitening as he struggled to justify himself. He was acting suspicious, he muttered, his voice faltering under Miller's unrelenting stare. "Didn't comply, wouldn't follow orders," and that justified pointing a weapon at him? Miller's anger flared, his words dripping with contempt. Grady's bravado crumbled, replaced by a defensive edge that trembled in his throat. "You don't understand what it's like out here," he said, his voice shaking as he tried to cling to some shred of dignity. "Sometimes you have to take control." Miller's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing to slits. "This isn't control," he said, each word deliberate and heavy. "It's abuse of power." Tucker, who had been a silent shadow until now, finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I tried to tell him," he said, glancing at Miller and Ramirez with a flicker of desperation. "I told him it was going too far." Grady whirled on him, his face twisting into a mask of betrayal. "Don't you dare," he snarled, but Miller's voice boomed over them both. "That's enough." The command silenced the two men instantly, their protests dissolving into the tense air. Miller turned to Ramirez, his expression resolute. "Secure their weapons and radios." Ramirez moved with swift precision, disarming Grady and Tucker as they stood frozen, their defiance melting into stunned silence. Miller held up the phone, his gaze locking with Grady's. "This video goes to internal affairs," he said firmly. "They'll decide what happens next, but from where I'm standing, you're done." Grady's face contorted with a volatile mix of rage and fear. "You can't," he began, but Miller cut him off again. "Yes, I can, and I will." He handed the phone back to Jack, his tone softening just enough to convey gratitude. "Thank you for staying calm. We'll take it from here." Jack nodded, his expression steady despite the storm of emotions swirling within him: relief, anger, and a quiet hope that justice might prevail. "Just make sure this doesn't happen again," he said, his voice firm yet weary. Miller met his gaze, his own eyes unwavering. "That's the plan." As Ramirez slipped the handcuffs onto Grady and Tucker's wrists, the metallic click reverberated through the quiet evening, a stark reminder of the consequences now unfolding. Grady's earlier swagger had vanished, replaced by a simmering fury that twisted his features into something almost unrecognizable. Tucker, meanwhile, kept his head bowed, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his own regret. Ramirez stood a few steps away, replaying the video on Jack's phone, his face growing grimmer with each frame. The footage was undeniable. Grady's threats, the gun aimed at Jack, Tucker's hesitant complicity laid bare in stark clarity. "This isn't just misconduct," Ramirez said quietly, his voice cutting through the stillness. "It's abuse of power, plain and simple." Miller nodded, his expression hardening into something unyielding. "Agreed," he said, turning to Grady and Tucker with a gaze that pierced like steel. "Take off your badges." Grady's face twisted in disbelief, his voice rising in a furious sputter. "You can't be serious. This is how you're handling this." Miller stepped closer, his presence towering despite his calm demeanor. "This isn't a negotiation. Remove your badges and place them on the ground. Now." Tucker hesitated, his hands moving slowly as he unclipped his badge, his fingers trembling with the weight of his decision. With a heavy sigh, he set it down, his eyes avoiding the others, shame etched into every line of his posture. Grady, however, stood rigid, his fists clenched so tightly his veins bulged. "You're just going to take his word," he snapped, jabbing a finger toward Jack. "This guy's spinning a story, and you're eating it up." Miller raised a hand, silencing him. "Enough. The video doesn't lie, Grady. Every word, every action, it's all there, and it's indefensible." Grady's anger erupted, his voice hoarse as he turned on Tucker. "It's his fault," he shouted, his face flushed with rage. "If you'd back me up instead of hesitating, we wouldn't be in this mess." Tucker's head snapped up, his own anger flaring as he fired back. "You think this is my fault? You're the one who pulled a gun on a man in front of a kid. I told you to stop, but you wouldn't listen, and you dare pin this on me." Grady lunged forward, his fury blinding him, but Ramirez stepped between them, his hand firm on his belt. "That's enough," he said, his voice a low growl that brooked no argument. Miller's gaze remained steady, unflinching. "This is exactly why you're both done. Your behavior isn't just a disgrace to the badge, it's dangerous." Grady sneered, his composure fracturing further. "You think you're better than us, Miller? You don't know what it's like out here." Miller's response was cold and cutting. "I know exactly what it's like. That's why I'm holding you accountable, Bakes. If we don't, nothing changes." Jack, who had been a quiet observer amidst the chaos, finally stepped forward, his voice calm but resonant with an unshakable conviction. "It's not just about the badge," he said, his eyes locking with Grady's. "It's about the responsibility that comes with it. You used your authority to intimidate, to bully, to endanger a child. That's not protecting anyone, that's cowardice." Grady's face reddened, but he had no retort, his defiance crumbling under the weight of Jack's words. "You think you can walk away from this, blame someone else, and everything will go back to normal?" Jack continued, his tone sharpening. "It won't. What you did here matters, and it won't be forgotten." The silence that followed was suffocating, Jack's words hanging in the air like a judgment no one could escape. Miller broke it, turning to Ramirez with a decisive nod. "Get their weapons and radios logged. They'll be processed when we get back to the station." Ramirez moved quickly, gathering Grady and Tucker's gear as Grady shot a venomous glare at Jack. "You're proud of yourself, huh?" he muttered, his voice dripping with bitterness. "Dragging us down with you." Jack met his gaze without flinching, his voice steady as stone. "I didn't drag you anywhere. You did that to yourself." Miller turned to Jack, his tone firm yet edged with respect. "Thank you for cooperating. We'll make sure this footage goes where it needs to." Jack nodded, his expression unreadable. A storm of emotions locked behind his calm facade. "Just make sure it does," he said quietly. Ramirez finished securing the gear, and Miller gestured toward the cruiser. "Let's go. We've got work to do." Grady and Tucker were led away, their earlier confidence replaced by a hollow defeat. Jack watched in silence as the patrol car's door slammed shut, the sound reverberating like a final note in a grim symphony. The sharp click of handcuffs echoed through the dusk as Ramirez secured Grady and Tucker's wrists, their fates sealed by their own actions. Grady's face was a tempest of rage and humiliation, his eyes burning with a fire that no longer held any power. Tucker, by contrast, stared at the ground, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of his choices had finally crushed him. "You're under arrest," Ramirez said flatly, his professionalism unwavering despite the undercurrent of disgust in his tone. "Charges will include misconduct, abuse of power, and endangerment." Grady twisted to glare at him, his voice a low growl. "You're making a mistake. We were just doing our jobs." Miller stepped closer, his presence unyielding. "No, what you did wasn't part of the job, it was a betrayal of it. And now you'll face the consequences." As the cruiser pulled away, a lone car approached from down the road, its headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. The driver, a middle-aged man with a furrowed brow and a curious glint in his eyes, slowed as he passed, craning his neck to take in the scene. The fading light cast long shadows over the truck, the dirt-streaked ground, and the figures standing in the aftermath tableau of justice unfolding, raw and unfiltered. For Jack, it was a moment of vindication, but also a stark reminder of the cost of unchecked power. For Miller and Ramirez, it was a duty fulfilled, a line drawn against those who would tarnish the badge they wore. And for Grady and Tucker, it was the end of a path paved with arrogance and abuse, a reckoning they could no longer escape. The night was alive with chaos, a symphony of flashing red and blue lights cutting through the darkness, like jagged streaks of lightning. Ed's gaze darted nervously between the swirling colors and the stern figures of the officers ahead, their silhouettes sharp against the glow. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles whitening as he guided the car to a slow, reluctant stop along the dusty shoulder of the highway. The gravel crunched beneath the tires, a gritty sound that seemed to echo the unease twisting in his chest. He took a deep breath, the cool night air flooding his lungs as he pushed the door open and stepped out, one hand fumbling into his pocket to retrieve his phone. His heart thudded unevenly, part curiosity, part dread as he faced the scene unfolding before him. "What's happening here?" His voice trembled slightly, betraying the calm he tried to project. He held the phone loosely at his side, fingers brushing its edges as if it were a lifeline. Officer Miller turned toward him, his posture rigid, his face etched with the weight of authority. "Official police business, sir," he said, his tone clipped but not unkind. "Please step back and keep your distance." Ed nodded, a quick, jerky motion, but his grip on the phone tightened. He lifted it slowly, deliberately, the screen glowing faintly as he pressed record. "I'll stay out of the way," he said, his words measured, carrying a quiet defiance. "Just want to make sure everything's on the record." His eyes flickered toward the officers, searching their faces for a reaction, his breath shallow as he braced for pushback. Across the scene, Grady caught sight of the man filming, his broad shoulders tensing beneath his uniform, his lips twisted into a sneer, frustration boiling beneath his skin like a storm ready to break. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, the words dripping with disdain. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, itching to act, but he stayed rooted in place, pinned by the weight of the camera's unblinking eye. Nearby, Jack stood still, his presence steady amid the rising tension. He watched it all unfold with a quiet intensity, his jaw set, his dark eyes tracking every movement. Then he felt a small, trembling hand brush against his arm. Noah, his nephew, standing close, his young face pale and wide-eyed in the flickering light. Jack's heart softened, and he rested a firm, reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder, guiding his attention away from the brewing confrontation. "Come here," Jack murmured, his voice low and soothing, a tether in the storm. He led Noah a few steps away, the gravel shifting under their feet, until the clamor of voices and lights dulled to a distant hum. Noah tilted his head up, his gaze meeting his uncle's, uncertainty shimmering in his eyes like unshed tears. "Are they going to get in trouble, Uncle Jack?" His voice was small, fragile, but threaded with a need to understand. Jack crouched slightly, bringing himself level with the boy, his expression calm but unyielding. "Yes, Noah," he said, his words deliberate, carrying the weight of truth. They will. What they did was wrong, plain and simple. When people misuse the power they're given, there have to be consequences. That's how justice works. His tone was steady, a quiet promise woven into every syllable. Noah hesitated, his small frame shifting as he glanced back at the cruiser. Inside, Grady and Tucker sat slumped, their faces shadowed, but their resentment palpable even from a distance. But what if they don't stop? Noah pressed, his voice rising with a mix of fear and frustration. What if they keep hurting people? Jack's features softened, though the steel in his resolve never wavered. He reached out, resting a hand lightly on Noah's arm. That's why we don't stay silent, Noah. That's why we stand up and speak out. The truth is stronger than any fist or badge. When enough people see it, when they really see it, things can't stay the same. Noah's fingers tightened around the phone he still clutched, its screen dark now but heavy with the footage he'd captured. He nodded slowly, the motion tentative but growing firmer as Jack's words sank in. A faint smile tugged at Jack's lips, a flicker of pride lighting his weathered face. That video you took, it's already making waves, Noah. You were brave today. Braver than most grown men I know. What you did matters. Behind them, Miller approached, his boots scuffing the gravel with purpose. His face was a mask of determination, lines carved deep by years of duty. We'll handle it from here, he said to Jack, his voice steady but edged with urgency. The video. Your statements, it's all going into the report. Jack straightened, meeting Miller's gaze with a nod. Make sure it's thorough, he replied, his tone firm, almost a challenge. People deserve to see the full story, every detail. Miller's eyes held his for a moment. Then he nodded back. They will, he assured, before turning to Noah. A rare, fleeting smile broke through his stern facade. Good work, kid. You did the right thing. Noah ducked his head, a flush of shy pride coloring his cheeks. Thank you, he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. The driver lowered his phone. The recording stopped and stepped forward cautiously, his movements deliberate as if testing the air. This is the kind of thing people need to see, he said, his voice steady now, gaining strength. Mind if I share it too? Miller glanced at him, assessing, then shrugged. As long as you're not in the way, do what you want. It's a free country. Ed grinned, a spark of triumph in his eyes. Oh, it'll get seen all right, he promised, already tapping at his screen. Inside the cruiser, Grady shifted uncomfortably, his glare cutting through the window toward Ed. This is a damn circus, he growled under his breath, his voice thick with bitterness. Miller stepped closer to the car, his shadow falling over Grady like a judgment. No, he corrected sharply, his tone slicing through the tension. This is accountability you've never grasped. Grady leaned back, his lips pressing into a thin, defiant line, but he said nothing, the weight of his situation sinking in. Jack turned back to Noah, his voice softening, but carrying a quiet strength. Remember this, Noah. Justice isn't always quick or easy. It's a fight, a hard one. But it's worth every second you put into it. Noah nodded again, his young face thoughtful, the wheels of his mind turning as he absorbed the lesson. The night didn't end there. The ripples of that moment stretched far beyond the lonely stretch of highway, carried by the video Noah had captured with trembling hands. Within hours, Ed uploaded it to social media, the grainy footage spilling across screens like wildfire. It spread fast, first a spark, then a blaze, shared and reshared until it was everywhere. The images were stark, Grady's snarled threats, the glint of a weapon drawn on an unarmed man. Jack's unshakable stand in the face of it all. The outrage was immediate, visceral. Comments poured in, a torrent of anger and demands for change. This is outrageous, one post declared, racking up thousands of likes. Cops like this don't belong anywhere near a badge. News outlets latched onto the story, their headlines screaming across front pages and broadcasts. Mississippi officers exposed in power abuse scandal. Marine veteran takes stand against corruption. Jack became a figure of quiet heroism, a man who'd faced down injustice without flinching. Noah, barely more than a child, emerged as a symbol of raw, unpolished courage. His video a beacon that lit up the dark corners of authority. Human rights groups seized the moment, their statements sharp and unyielding. "This is a glaring wake-up call," one organization proclaimed. "Reform in law enforcement isn't optional, it's urgent. We salute Jack Carter and his nephew Noah for shining a light where it's desperately needed." Veterans groups echoed the sentiment, their voices booming with pride. "Jack Carter is the embodiment of honor," a spokesperson said on a national broadcast, his words ringing with conviction. He didn't just protect his nephew, protected what's right for all of us. The pressure crashed down on the Brookhaven Police Department like a tidal wave. By the next day, Chief Daniels stood before a sea of cameras, his face drawn, his hands gripping a crumpled statement. "We're aware of the incident involving Officers Grady and Tucker," he began, his voice flat. "Rehearsed, an internal investigation is underway. This department does not tolerate misconduct or abuse of power." The words sounded hollow to the crowd gathered outside the station, their signs waving high justice for Jack, no more corruption. Their chants rolled through the air, loud and unyielding. "Talk is cheap," a protester bellowed through a megaphone, her voice raw with frustration. "We want action." Inside the department, the gears of scrutiny ground into motion. An internal affairs team descended, their presence heavy and methodical. They dug deep, pulling emails, reviewing body cam footage, sifting through disciplinary records. What they found wasn't isolated. Grady and Tucker weren't lone actors. Whispers of similar incidents surfaced, stories from residents who'd long complained but never been heard. "It's about damn time," one local told a reporter, his voice rough with years of pent-up anger. "People have been screaming about this forever. Maybe now they'll listen." Jack, meanwhile, retreated from the spotlight. He waved off interview requests, his voice firm when a persistent reporter caught him on the phone. "This isn't about me," he said, cutting through the noise. "It's about fixing what's broken. Keep your eyes on that." Noah, though, couldn't escape the attention. His name buzzed through schools and news segments, his quiet bravery a spark that inspired. "I just did what Uncle Jack taught me," he said during a brief local interview, his voice soft but steady. "He told me the truth matters, so I showed it." The fallout was swift. Grady and Tucker faced criminal charges. Their cases rushed forward under the weight of undeniable evidence. The department suspended others, reassigned more, as the investigation widened. State officials stepped in, announcing new oversight for Brookhaven's training. Stricter protocols, a promise of accountability. "It's not perfect," a protester said, watching the changes unfold, her voice cautious but hopeful. "But it's something." Back home, life quieted for Jack and Noah. The house hummed with routine, Jack tinkering with tools, Noah trailing behind, safe in the familiar. But something had changed. Noah moved differently now, his shoulders straighter, his eyes sharper. One evening, as they cleaned fishing rods by the porch light, he looked up at Jack, his voice steady. "Uncle Jack, why didn't you just fight them? You could have stopped them quick if you'd hit back." Jack paused, setting the rod down, his gaze thoughtful. "Fighting doesn't always fix things, Noah," he said, his words slow, deliberate. "Sometimes the strongest move is holding your ground without throwing a punch. When you stay calm, they've got nothing to twist against you." Noah nodded, mulling it over, the lesson sinking deep. "So you won without fighting?" Jack's smile was faint, weathered but warm. "Something like that." Over the weeks, Noah's questions kept coming. What had happened, what it meant, how it changed things. Jack answered each one, patient and honest, showing his nephew that courage wasn't about muscle or noise. It was about standing tall, speaking clear, and letting the truth do the heavy lifting. The highway that night had been more than a standoff. It was a lesson in justice, carved into the world one trembling frame at a time. The air was thick with tension that night, a quiet Mississippi road stretching endlessly under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. Noah's heart pounded in his chest, a frantic rhythm that echoed the fear surging through him as he clutched his phone, fingers trembling over the record button. He was just a kid, barely 16, yet the weight of the moment pressed down on him, like a storm cloud ready to burst. Across from him stood his Uncle Jack, broad-shouldered and steady, facing two uniformed officers whose voices cut through the stillness with sharp, menacing edges. The scene unfolded like a nightmare, accusations flying, hands hovering too close to holsters. and Jack's calm refusal to bend under their threats. Noah's breath hitched as he captured it all. The shaky footage a lifeline he didn't fully understand yet. Inside, he wrestled with a tangle of emotion stir that this could end in blood. Anger at the unfairness of it all, and a flicker of pride for the man who raised him, standing tall when most would crumble. Back at school, the echoes of that night clung to Noah like a second skin. His classmates noticed the shift in him, the way his shoulders squared a little more, his voice carrying a quiet strength it hadn't before. Some watched him with wide-eyed admiration, whispering among themselves about the boy who'd faced down corruption and lived to tell it. Others simply leaned in, hanging on his every word as he recounted the story. His tone soft but threaded with a pride he couldn't hide. In the classroom, sunlight streamed through dusty windows, illuminating rows of desks as a teacher's. Harrow, with her kind eyes and firm belief in right and wrong, called him to the front during a lesson on community and justice. The room fell silent, 30 pairs of eyes fixed on him as he stood there, hands shoved deep in his pockets at first, then slowly rising as he spoke. "What I learned," Noah said, his voice steadying with each word, "is that doing what's right can scare you to death. But if you don't step up, who's going to?" The words hung there, heavy and true, and for a moment, he felt taller than he ever had, not just a kid anymore, but someone who'd glimpsed the cost of courage. Jack, meanwhile, felt the ripples of that night seep into every corner of his life in Brookhaven. He'd never been one for attention, preferring the quiet hum of routine early mornings at the lake, the creak of his old pickup truck. But now, townsfolk saw him differently. In the grocery store, amid the clatter of carts and the rustle of plastic bags, a stranger might pause by the cereal aisle, eyes lighting up with recognition. "You're Jack Carter, aren't you?" they'd say, voice warm with respect. At the hardware shop, where sawdust hung in the air and nails rattled in metal bins, an older man once gripped his hand, calluses rough against Jack's palm, and declared, "You showed us what real guts look like." Jack would duck his head, a faint flush creeping up his neck, and mutter something humble. "It wasn't just me," he'd insist, redirecting their praise like a river carving a new path. "Noah's the one who had the guts to show the world the truth." That's what tipped the scales. But the gratitude followed him, a quiet shadow he couldn't shake. The local veterans group caught wind of his story, their weathered faces and proud postures filling a cramped community hall one evening. They'd asked him to speak, to share what happened under that lonely street lamp. Jack hesitated at first, his stomach knotting at the thought of dredging up the memorite glint of steel, the snarl of authority gone rotten. But their earnest pleas wore him down, and soon he stood before them, the room thick with the scent of coffee and old wood. His voice, low and even, carried across the crowd as he described the confrontation, the way his heart had thudded but his feet stayed planted. "I didn't do it for a pat on the back," he told them, meeting their eyes one by one. "I did it because someone had to. And if my standing there helps even one of you remember you've got that same power, then every second of it was worth it." The room exploded into applause, chairs scraping as people rose, their hands clapping in a thunderous wave. Jack stood still, his face a mask of calm, but his eyes shimmered with something deep, an unspoken gratitude, relief, maybe even hope. For Noah, the aftermath stretched far beyond that single act of bravery. The world looked different now, its cracks and possibilities laid bare before him. He threw himself into the school's debate club, the auditorium buzzing with nervous energy as he learned to shape his thoughts into weapons of reason. Each meeting sharpened him, his voice growing bolder, his arguments tighter, fueled by a fire he hadn't known he carried. One afternoon, he burst through the front door, sneakers scuffing the hardwood, a flyer crumpled in his fist. "Uncle Jack, look at this," he exclaimed, eyes blazing with a hunger for change. It was a community event on justice reform, the paper promising speeches and discussions under the glow of string lights in the town square. Jack unfolded it, his rough fingers tracing the bold print, a slow smile tugging at his mouth. "Of course we'll go," he said, voice warm and sure. "Learning, listening, that's how you keep the momentum alive." The event buzzed with life tables strewn with pamphlets, voices overlapping in passionate debate, and Noah left it buzzing too, volunteering soon after with groups bridging the gap between cops and citizens. His small steps sent waves outward, pulling others into the current. Life settled into a gentler pace as months slipped by. Jack and Noah returned to their fishing trips, the lake a mirror of calm beneath the sky. The dock creaked under their weight one evening, the sun dipping low, painting the water in strokes of gold and amber. Noah dangled his line, the silence between them comfortable until he broke it. His voice soft but probing. "Do you think it'll happen again?" What they did. Jack stared out at the horizon, the breeze tugging at his hair, his mind drifting to that dark road. "I can't say it won't," he admitted, his honesty raw. "But here's what I can promise. As long as there's folks like you, ready to stand tall, there's always a shot at something better." Noah nodded, his jaw set, determination etching lines into his young face. "Then I'll keep standing," he said, and the words felt like a vow. Their story didn't stay confined to Brookhaven's sleepy streets. It grew wings, soaring through town halls where voices clashed over right and wrong, classrooms where kids scribbled notes on accountability, and online forums where strangers typed furious debates. That grainy video Noah had shot kept circulating, a spark that refused to die, igniting questions about power and its misuse. A civil rights advocate, her voice sharp and unwavering on a flickering TV screen. "Put it plainly, this isn't just about a couple of rogue cops. It's about a system begging for a reckoning." Jack Carter's courage shows us silence won't fix it, action will. Across the state, people stirred. Grassroots meetings sprang up in church basements and libraries, the air thick with coffee and resolve as folks shared their own brushes with injustice. A woman at one forum, her hands twisting nervously in her lap, spoke up. "I never thought anyone hear me," she said, voice trembling then firming. "But if Jack can stare down guns and speak, I can open my mouth too." Change crept in, slow but stubborn. Local governments, prodded by the growing clamor, rolled out new rules officer conduct codes, training sessions heavy on de-escalation, community ties over cold distance. Jack, despite his aversion to the spotlight, became a reluctant beacon. People cornered him at gas stations or diners, voices low and eager, asking how he kept his cool that night. "You don't need to be some caped crusader," he'd tell them, leaning against his truck, the metal warm from the sun. "You just need to care enough to move. That's it." Noah, too, found himself in demonschools and youth groups clamoring for his story. Standing before a sea of young faces, he'd shrug, almost shy. "I didn't feel brave," he'd say, his voice cutting through the chatter. "I just did what felt right. And I learned even the little things you do can shake up the big stuff." Their tale became more than a story, it turned into a roadmap. Towns set up citizen boards to watch over their police. Advocates pushed for open records. Body cam footage no longer buried in bureaucracy. Justice, they all learned, wasn't a gift dropped in your lap, it was a garden, tended with sweat and spine. Jack's quiet grit and Noah's fierce spark proved that even against a towering wall of wrong, courage could crack it open. Months later, in a cramped TV studio, Jack sat under harsh lights, summing it up. "We didn't mean to turn the world upside down," he said, his voice rough but steady. "I just wanted to keep Noah safe. But sometimes, standing up once gives everyone else a push to do the same." The camera lingered on his words, a call ringing out to anyone listening. Back where it started, that quiet Mississippi road lay unchanged, but its echo stretched far, leaving a legacy of hope and grit. Jack and Noah's courageous-rooted strength, his bold leap shout that injustice feeds on quiet, and breaking it demands a voice, no matter how shaky. Their story whispered a truth. Fairness isn't freaks forged, step by stubborn step, through the raw, messy power of standing when it counts.